circled here on this sheet, but this needs a bit of expansion, and so I'll try to expand it for you. And let's see if we can get into this so we understand the whole background. In order to follow the course of this, the best instrument, and I think to tell you to bring it, is the stuff at the back of beginnings, that De La Salle diary, as I call it, the chronology at the back of beginnings. If you go to these dates in beginnings in the back, you'll get pretty much a summary of what each decree said specifically, what the fines were and who was involved, etc., etc. All right, now I've put the outline up here in this fashion, but before we get to that, I guess we should look at the top of the sheet first. So first of all, we have already seen that it was when Father Baudrin got the founder to open a second school in the parish of Saint-Sulpice on the Rue de Bac, that the first controversy developed between the founder and the schoolmasters, because he was invading their territory to which they had a franchise granted by the chantre, or the écolâtre as he was called, the supervisor of schools of the diocese. De La Salle finally won that. The claim was that they were teaching for money, or that they were not teaching the poor, they were teaching the rich. Well, the founder finally got around that one by pointing out that the students were mostly poor, but the main thing was the brothers weren't getting paid for it. So they got out of that one because the challenge was that the brothers were doing this for their own profit, which of course was easy for them to prove they were not. So then when they opened up the third school in the parish on the Rue Placide, and they got physical there and vandalized the school and so on, but it was largely through the influence of Madame Maintenon at the court that she was able to apply pressure to have there's a quotation from it in one of those colored sheets that I handed out at the beginning of where Boutet is talking about the relationships between the pastors, between the De La Salle and the government officials. So it's the influence of Madame de Maintenon, who was close to the king, that saved him on that occasion. So here we are 5 years later, and the founder is now operating in, if you look at that map of Paris, on the Rue de Charonne in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. At one point, mistranslated, must be a mistranslation, he calls it the Church of Saint Antoine. It's not a church, the parish of St. Paul. He says the parish of Saint Antoine. It's not a parish, it's a suburb. A lot of the suburbs, all the suburbs were named after saints, probably the saint for which there would have been a church at one time. So this is way up by the Bastille, which at that time existed, and it would have been number 10 there, and down this side street on the Rue de Charonne, that's where this school was open. Now, why did he go there? He went there because he lost the school on the Grand Maison. So after only 5 years, now we're finished with the second volume, by the way, and we're into the third. But so De La Salle has to leave the Grand Maison because he loses the lease. Did you enjoy that story of the enterprising brothers? The haunted house, driving the guy out, and the ghost of, what's her name, Sister Saint Fiacre, kept making a racket all the time and scaring the daylights out of the thing, moving the kid around and so on and so forth. But even at the very end, Sister Fiacre didn't want to see the brothers go, so she started a little earthquake all her own there with the cart laden with all of the furnishings, remember, from Madame Voison. He's got a lot of stuff, all of those beds, mattresses, and everything else. If you figure the amount of stuff they must have had to move out of the house. Well, I think that's one of Bland's best stories. What do you think about the truth of this?
Hardly so.
I think they may have had some brothers who would be something like that crowd in Buttimer 3, you know. Capable of dressing up and putting on various disguises and so on, and spooking around the place and so on. I suspect that's probably one explanation. They had ways of getting things done. So So he moves to the Rue Saint-Antoine, or to the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, on the Rue de Charonne. And, well, he does a couple of things. First of all, the pastor there had decided there were too many religious in that big sprawling parish of St. Paul. He didn't want any more of them. But he made an exception to bring the founder in because he heard of all the good that he could do, and so he sets up a gratuitous school. But in moving from the Grand Maison, he not only opens a school, but he moves the novitiate there, and he moves the Sunday academy there. So he takes with him not only the furniture, but the novices and the novitiate, and the Sunday school for these late teenagers that he was trying to give some kind of an advanced education to. And the big thing he does, now on the sheet there I have FEC in parentheses, and of course that is the sign that they hang up a sign outside, Frères des Écoles Chrétiennes. By the way, the French brothers never sign themselves FSC. They always sign themselves FEC. They don't like the Latin. Latin was forbidden. But that's not the reason, because they don't want to be confused with the Frères des Sacré-Cœur. The FSC for them means Brothers of Sacred Heart. So in order to avoid that, and they like the Frères des Écoles Chrétiennes. They say that, we say Christian Brothers for short, but they rattle off Frères des Écoles Chrétiennes as if it were one word. Somewhat the same way they rattle off Jean-Baptiste de La Salle as if it were one word. So anyway, they got this big sign, Frères des Écoles Chrétiennes, and it's that sign that causes a good bit of the trouble. So here they are, and kind of being a little bold about going public. But on the other hand, looking at the remote location there, I suppose the founder felt, well, he was having all these problems with Chez Tardy. Chez Tardy wouldn't give him one bit of help in trying to hold on to the Grand Maison. He might have gotten it fairly cheaply, but no assistance whatsoever. So the founder, and Chez Tardy, of course, is frustrated at the failure of his plot to get rid of De La Salle and keep the brothers, So he seems perfectly willing to let them go and again the pastor's essential piece had no big interest in the novitiate anyhow, as we saw with Baudrin. They wanted to keep this thing as a purely parochial sort of a thing. But I suppose the only thing he regretted was seeing the Sunday school get out of his parish and go to the other end of town. And all the while they were there, this is now the founder's headquarters, and it's the novitiate, and just as the brothers used to go all the way out to Vaugirard, now they have to go all the way in the other direction, to the other side of the Seine, and to go to join the novices on weekends and during vacation time. So this operation is going along and thriving pretty well there. Now again, Bland has a flash forward. He carries the story on into the famine of 1709. We'll see more of that later. And the Sisters of the Holy Cross across the street, who take good care of him and so on. By the way, that's the setting of Cyrano de Bergerac, the convent that Cyrano goes to, or however that thing winds up, is this same convent. So here we are in the school at Saint-Antoine. So now, and Bland is probably correct on this, the writing masters and the schoolmasters begin to sense that Chez Tardy is abandoning all of the support of De La Salle. And it's quite possible that Chez Tardy himself called them in or gave some signal, this is perfectly possible, that having been frustrated in his attempt to get rid of De La Salle through the ecclesiastical route, he's now willing to let nature take its course in terms of it. Because again, he's the only one who could have saved De La Salle in this whole business, and he doesn't come forward at all. And I think you have to see that very, very carefully. It's still the conflict between De La Salle and Chez Tardy. And Chez Tardy wants to keep the brothers, but he's not the least bit interested in having any relationship further with De La Salle. And so that gets to be a problem. And De La Salle finally forces the issue himself at a certain point at the end of this, as we'll see. Now, to keep track of this whole thing, you have to recognize that of course, you're in a monarchy here, with a very strong, powerful monarch, Louis XIV, and his parliament. Now, the parliament is not a legislative body in this instance, but it's the royal court. This is the court where everything, all the royal business finally winds up when it goes up the line. And most important cases had to be judged here. For example, the founder's father and grandfather, who were on the presidial court in Reims, that was a provincial court that had very limited jurisdiction over civil cases and criminal cases, but the major civil and criminal cases had to go to the Parliament in Paris. And anything that had anything to do with policy had to go through this body also. Now, Blam mixes up the schoolmasters and the writing masters, as most people do who don't get close to this. But I think I made the point way in the beginning of this whole thing, that the writing masters were a guild protected by royal decree, a guild of professional scribes whose principal function was to verify the authenticity of writing and signatures and to preserve the quality of fine writing, with a very strict apprenticeship that not everybody got through, and an absolute monopoly on the teaching of writing. They were at odds a good part of the time with the schoolmasters who were teaching their kids little by little and more to write, and it was a bone of contention between the two groups. The schoolmasters were under the jurisdiction of the diocesan superintendent of schools, the écolâtre. And the schoolmasters, therefore, were assigned their territory from the chancery office of the diocese. So we have these two groups, and they really don't get together in the beginning of this thing. It starts not with the schoolmasters, but with the writing masters. When the writing masters began to see this sign, now why were they concerned about the sign? They had a monopoly as a guild. They were a corporation. Here is a group without any corporate identity declaring itself to be a corporation with a name and a big placard outside the school. See, it's that sign. The sign was a sign that they were thinking of themselves as an organized body. And that's one of the key legal issues all the way through this thing. And and the judgments are passed with that problem at the center of so many of the judgments. So they complain to the police, the lieutenant of the police. Now the lieutenant of the police is operating out of the office known as the Châtelet, right on the banks of the Seine. You can go there and see it today. It's right next to where Marie Antoinette was in prison before they chopped all their heads off. And so it's at the Châtelet that the police are operating out of. They still do today, as a matter of fact, I guess. And so we're now into the year 1704. So on February the 7th, the police arrive at the school, confiscate all the materials, disperse the brothers, and close the whole thing down. And all of this, they put all of they don't take it out of there yet. They leave it there, but it's all put under bond and confiscated. And 2 days later, De La Salle was summoned to answer the complaint of the writing masters. De La Salle realizes that the thing is useless, and so he doesn't even appear. But meanwhile, on February the 14th, the schoolmasters now go to the diocese. And so so the first of the decrees we really get comes not from the Châtelet, but from the diocese on the 14th of February. So to fill that out a little bit, here was the decree from the écolâtre of the diocese on February 14th. The judgment of the écolâtre of Notre Dame is of course the cathedral, against De La Salle. Against De La Salle. He is forbidden to teach. Right now I haven't got that clear on the sheet, but it's important to keep track of this. This is a judgment against Jean-Baptiste De La Salle, who is forbidden to teach. Now from this moment on, it's illegal for De La Salle to teach, to engage or to assign teachers or conduct schools. He's forbidden to do that without the express permission of the écolâtre of Notre Dame. So it's a diocesan decree, and the écolâtre probably had no problem whatsoever issuing that decree against De La Salle, since it's not so terribly long ago. It's just during the past year that he's had this run-in with the cardinal, and made the cardinal look bad and so on and so forth. So, and Chetardi's power and influence, you can be sure, is behind that. Okay, so now at first De La Salle he doesn't respond to that summons. And Poutet thinks, and I think rightly, now there's always this thing, well, he was humble and all that garbage and that this was probably a shrewd move on his part, as it was very often in these things, because he felt that there was enough popular support for the schools and what he was doing among the people. And that if he defaulted and didn't defend himself, he could always appeal, and leave the thing hanging. So anyway, he engages a lawyer on this particular occasion. So on the 22nd of February, then, he's condemned by default by the Châtelet, by the police. But this condemnation says that he may accept in his schools only those students whose parents are certifiably poor, and he's sentenced to a fine of 50 livres. So now he's got two judgments against him. So he hires a lawyer, all right, and I've got his name someplace, it doesn't matter. And so on the Feast of St. Joseph, on the 13th of March, De La Salle appeals, all right, to Parliament against the decree of the diocese. And then on the 4th of May, he puts a petition, so he makes an appeal against this prohibition to teach and so on and so forth. And then on the 4th of May, he appeals the decree of the Châtelet on the basis that the confiscation cannot hold because the diocese has already assigned the equipment that was put under ban in Saint Antoine. It's already assigned it to the schoolmasters. See, so he's playing the two of them, the one against the other. So he's appealing both. He's appealing to the Parliament against the diocese, because it's a higher power, of course, and the only place he could appeal. And he's appealing directly to the Châtelet because he says you can't hold these things confiscated because the diocese has already assigned them to the schoolmaster. See the point? So it was kind of a clever thing. So these appeals are hanging all the way through this whole controversy. That is, they're not finally settled until you get down to 1706. So meanwhile, the whole thing is up in the air. But in that appeal against the confiscation, on the 20th of May, it didn't take the Châtelet long, they reject that petition, right? And so they send the sergeant of arms and they remove all of the writing, all the writing materials and all the samples of writing that they had and the big sign that was outside the school. So now the writing masters begin to say, well, it's not only De La Salle himself, but it's all these other characters that he's working with. So on the 7th of June in 1704, the writing masters now feeling, they're getting a thirst for blood. They've got De La Salle where they want him, and they've confiscated all of the stuff. And so now they get up a petition against De La Salle and the brothers. And the brothers are all mentioned by name. As it says here, petition of the Guild and Community of Writing and Arithmetic Masters of the City of Paris to the Lieutenant General of the Police to allow them to cite before him De La Salle, Ponce, Nicholas, and 15 other brothers. Ponce, Nicholas Fouillé, of course, and 15 other brothers, demanding the sanction of the king's household against them. And so on July 11th, the Lieutenant General levies a fine of 100 livres against De La Salle and 50 livres against the other brothers. All right? So now, in the middle of, so that decree of the 11th of what have I got here? 7/11? Yeah, July. The 11th of July, that becomes a key decree, all right? So the 22nd of February is the default, and the 11th of July is this restraining order, where all the brothers are mentioned by name, and De La Salle is fined 100 livres, and the brothers are fined 50 livres, because they can't pay anything, so the confiscated material was sold and given over in lieu of the fine to the writing master. Now, this, of course, this decree, of course, applies to all of Paris. So now the two pastors over the pastor of St. Martin and St. Hippolyte over down in the Faubourg Saint-Marcel, down at the bottom of the thing there. See the Boulevard Saint-Marcel, and it's number 9 here. That's where Vuillard was running the teacher training school. Okay, so those two pastors said, "Well, all right, De La Salle is this whole thing is these decrees have been issued against them." So they decided to petition the Châtelet for permission for Nicolas Vuillard and Brother Gervais, who was teaching with him, to have the permission to continue to operate the teacher training center in their parish. And so the answer to that comes from the Châtelet rejecting it, confirming the decree of the 22nd of February and the 11th of July, right? To say that there's no way that this community can get any kind of authorization until they get letters patent, but that the pastor is perfectly free to engage any teachers that he wants to engage. Okay. So but they can't have any connection with De La Salle. So it's at that point, of course, Vuillard and Gervais have to make the choice. If Vuillard figures he can save the teacher training thing by putting aside his habit, putting aside any evidence of a bond with De La Salle. Bland has a De La Salle going to him and having him turn away and so on. It's very unlikely that De La Salle went near him at all. And he just dissociates himself from De La Salle and from the brothers. Whereas Gervais said no, he couldn't do that, and so he goes back to the Rue Princesse and continues to stay with the rest of the brothers. Okay, so that's the situation in August of that year. But now in September, the writing masters and the schoolmasters decide, let's see if we can't get rid of this pestilence. Brothers, De La Salle, and the whole shebang, let's put our forces together. Let's suppress our own differences among one another. So on the 30th of September that year, just before school was due to open, at the end of the vacation time, they again send a petition to the Châtelet against the Frère Prétendu, because they've already, and the so-called superior of the so-called brothers. Because, of course, now legally they have no legal authorization to continue to operate as a community. So, on December the 4th, the schoolmasters now, coming down to the end of 1704, petitioned Parliament to apply the decree of the diocese, see how complicated this gets, to all the brothers individually. Now, the decree of the 14th of February from the diocese was only against De La Salle, but now the schoolmasters are making their move to Parliament to have that decree of the diocese applied to De La Salle. Right? So the brothers, as soon as the New Year, the Christmas holidays were over, so to speak, the brothers reply that the brothers are in the employ of the pastor of Saint-Sulpice, that they were not hired, they're not paid by John Baptiste de La Salle. They are distinct from John Baptiste de La Salle. Now that might have worked, except for the fact that the founders' appeal of the 19th of March was before the Parliament. And here was the brothers' response to the petition of the writing masters that they were not associated with De La Salle. So on the 26th of March, the reply of Parliament is that the two cases would be proved together, would be tried together, the appeal of De La Salle and the response of the brothers that they were not associated with De La Salle, and it was up to them to prove that they had no connection whatsoever with John Baptiste de La Salle, which meant they would have all had to abandon the habit, abandon any community living, and gone on their own as individual teachers in the schools. something they were not prepared to do. Okay? There was a long negotiation, as you can see, that was in March, and the judgment doesn't come until almost a year later in the following February, and the final decision of the Parliament, and there was a lot of back and forth and politicking going on behind the scenes here. The writing masters, consulting with the cardinal what they're going to do about this, consulting with the writing masters keep insisting their points. They don't care what happens as long as they don't teach writing. And the schoolmasters saying they don't care what happens, but they got to get rid of these people because they're intruding on their turf. So finally, the king's judgment was, well, whatever the case is, they have no right to be operating until they get letters patent. The letters patented, they can't have anything. So the final decree comes on the 5th of February, that a total ban on the community. They cannot operate as a community. They cannot hang up any sign. There's a specific reference to the sign and so on. Let me read that part of it here. February 5th, 1706. Court order issued by the Court of Parliament. It denies the appeal of De La Salle against the Écolâtre of Paris. De La Salle is forbidden to conduct schools for the instruction of youth, to establish any community that could be called a training college for teachers in the primary schools, or to post any special title on the door of the schools. In addition, a fine of 12 livres was imposed. So De La Salle now is completely illegal, right, by decree of the Royal Parliament at this point. He has, meanwhile, of course, he had to move out when they closed down the school in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. He moved over to the Rue Saint-Honoré, where he had opened a small school, a little bit out of the way, still on the right bank, on the other side of the Seine, and that's where he was holed up during this time by himself. And he sent the novices back down to the Rue Princesse, and so that's where he was. So again, on the 19th of March, De La Salle was notified of the decision of the Parliament. Okay, so it's interesting where we are now here. We're 1706, and last night some of those letters you were reading to Roland were written in August of 1796. But by that time, a few more things happened. So De La Salle is kind of at a loss what to do. What's he going to do here now? Let the whole thing go down the drain, or what? And of course, while all this is going on, the brothers are still continuing to teach their classes in the four schools in the parish of Saint-Sulpice. One of the Rue Princesse, the Rue de Bac, the Rue Placide, and another one had been opened on the Rue Fossé Monsieur le Prince. And so these four schools continue to operate, the brothers continue to go to their classes and all that sort of stuff, while all this legal battle is going back and forth. But the final decree has been against De La Salle, against the community, and against any kind of a teacher training thing.
Since this final order came from the Court of Parliament, is this supposed to apply to all France then, or just for the other schools?
Apparently it was just, since this involved the guild in Paris, just as far as I understand any background, I'm not aware of any attempt to oppose this outside of Paris. Because there's another similar case again in Chartres, and that's resolved almost the same way, but it seems to have been dealt differently. Whereas on the other hand, the writing masters and the schoolmasters in Avignon bring a similar suit down there, and they lose. And the city magistrate in Avignon judges in favor of the brothers. Of course, that was extraterritorial as far as France, but I'm not aware that it applied anywhere else. But anyway, meanwhile, the brothers, of course, technically are still teaching in a charity school under the direction of the pastor, who's Chétardy. But through all of this thing, Chétardy doesn't lift a hand to help the brothers or anything like that. But now with this court thing going on and so on, De La Salle figures, well, you know, this determination of Chétardy to ruin the whole thing, that maybe he ought to get out of the way a little bit himself and keep a low profile. So first of all, he's not living in the parish anymore. He's living in the Rue, on the Rue Saint-Honoré in the school of St. Roch, the parish of St. Roch. And now he decides to go off into a retreat. And he doesn't let anybody know where he is. Gives the impression that he's far, far away. Actually goes to the Carmelites, which is just about a few doors away from Saint-Sulpice on the Rue de Vaugirard. It's not very far away, but he goes into seclusion there for a couple of weeks and leaves Brother Thomas in charge, who apparently got along pretty well with the pastor. So Brother Thomas becomes more and more to the fore. And according to Bland, anyway, Chez Tardy thinks that the founder has kind of given up and disappeared altogether, and he's trying to persuade Thomas to become the superior of the brothers, and of course under his direction. And this was apparently a real attempt to take over the Institute in De La Salle's absence. But of course, Brother Thomas will have none of it. We'll see a lot of this Brother Thomas as we go along. So De La Salle continues to use him all the way through as a kind of a negotiator with Chez Tardy. Right, so he makes this kind of a retreat, and he thinks the thing over. And the brothers are wondering what to do, and everything is up in the air. And meanwhile, through all of this business, Chez Tardy was beginning to realize that he was in some kind of real trouble. As I noted up above there, is right at the beginning, all the way from the beginning of the school year in 1705, he finally closed the one school on the most recently opened one, the one on the Rue Fossé de Monsieur Le Prince. So he closes that, and he's not getting the money for the support of the schools. And the rumor is that the brothers have been condemned by the court and so on, and that they'll be abandoning this thing. And so why not give up on the brothers and try to get other teachers? But it's little by little over the course of this that Chez Tardy realizes that no, he wants the brothers and that they're doing a good job, and he wouldn't be satisfied with any kind of other substitute teachers. So the founder's tossing, what's he going to do now about this whole situation in Paris? So he goes off and he makes this long retreat. And the brothers are trying to look for some direction for him. So again, he takes a long, long time to make up his mind. But finally by July, well before the good month before the end of the official end of the school year, De La Salle finally decides, okay, the hell with it. We'll just shut the whole thing down, lockout. And leaves one brother in charge, probably Thomas, to mind the house. And he just sends the brothers all off, most of them up to the north, to Rouen, where he's already, by this time, of course, he's already got St. Leon, and he's already settled in Rouen. So he sends them all off, and they just take off. So the kids arrive from school the next day and find the doors locked. So they think, oh, maybe the brothers declared a holiday, or maybe they went on a picnic or something. And it lasts and lasts and lasts, and what's going on? They go to the pastor. Now the parents are all up in arms, and so forth. And so it forces Chez Tardy's hand. So finally, Chez Tardy contacts the founder, who's back up in Rouen by this time, and he says he wants him back. And so De La Salle answers rather forcefully, doesn't he? Page 50. Now, by the way, when Bland tells this story, the first time the schools are closed for 3 weeks, and then they're closed for 3 months. It's almost certain that there was only one closure. Bland gets things all mixed up. That's when we're not following too closely. So the closing of the schools was a 3-month period, July, August, and September. So John Baptist answered that he had preferred, at the top of the page, he had preferred to yield rather than be exposed to the perpetual disturbance which had caused so much harm to the brothers. Because, of course, once this decree was there, the writing masters were continually harassing the brothers. They were coming to the school. They were checking up to see whether the kids were really poor and all that sort of stuff and so on and so forth. He added that he was unwilling to send the brothers back. He mentioned the way they had been treated recently had discouraged several. It was not possible for him to find replacements for them on short notice. He added he was unwilling to send brothers back to St. Sulpice unless he was given assurances that they would be able to carry on their work in peace and under the parish priest's protection. Finally, the wise superior, to make sure that he would thenceforth be shielded from all such vexations, which, by annoying the brothers, had disrupted their schools, ordered the director who had remained alone in the residence to negotiate with the parish priest and made sure that in the future there would be no further danger or similar ordeals. And so the requested measures were taken by Chez Tardy. So Chez Tardy had to tell the writing masters to back off. Well, the writing masters say, okay, you want us to back off, we want some guarantee that you're not getting kids in here that will be able to pay. And so that compromise was worked out with them. With the writing, Chez Tardy was able to compromise with the police and the writing masters, and the fundamentally in all the compromise, no reference was made to De La Salle at all. Chetardi finally said, no, these brothers are in my employ, they're employed by me, the house is rented by me, their salary is paid by me. As the pastor of Saint Sulpice, I take full responsibility for what they're doing. And they said, well, what guarantee have we got? Get it in writing. They said, well, we'll issue certificates to those who are poor. And so he appointed this Father Gergi, who we'll see again, to be in charge of that, but apparently they gave the tickets to everybody and so didn't change the clientele of the school in any kind of a way. Now, of course, he could have done that in the very beginning. It would have been the end of the thing. But is there any question about any of that?
I'm sort of surprised in this prolonged crisis how neither the king nor his wife sort of took some kind of...
Well, they did.
Well...
The king got interested in it during that whole period from if you look between 1705 and 1706 there on that chart, it's in March 26th that the two cases were going to be taken together, but it's only a year later. And so while all this is going on, the king is very much involved. Everybody's trying to get to him. And of course it involves the cardinal, who's an important personage, and the pastor of Saint Sulpice, and it involves this powerful guild, and so on. And so the attitude that the king apparently communicated down the line was, because there were some people that were trying to save De La Salle, the king's thing says, well, they've got to have letters patent, and until they get letters patent from the king, they haven't got a ghost of a chance.
Does the schoolmasters have any kind of an organization of themselves?
Apparently, because Bland at least refers to the corporation of the schoolmasters, and I'm sure they probably did. But again, it was they probably had some sort of an association, but it had no real independent authority the way the writing masters did. The writing masters had royal protection, but all the schoolmasters were under the jurisdiction of the diocese. So what does it mean, for example, if you have an organization of Catholic school teachers in diocesan schools today? Not an awful lot, although some of them are unionized. But it wasn't that. Is that what's behind it?
Yeah, if I get it right, they were just individual. You just go out and get your own clients, and you had your own.
No, you had to have the territory.
It was all individual, wasn't it?
Yes, but the territory was assigned by the diocese. So you just couldn't open up one of those schools. See, that's the problem. You had to wait until somebody died or look for a territory that nobody had yet taken over and open your school there. And then all of the kids who lived in that area who were willing to pay to come to your tutoring for all practical purposes, then you got the revenue for that. It was a franchise. Okay? But apparently they had some sort of corporate meetings Bland calls it the corporation of schoolmasters. Now, of course, Bland because he often confuses the two groups, and he may be called that maybe there was no real general organization, but they would have had to operate together in some way, because they collectively, at least on this occasion.
In terms of how the founder saw Providence, why didn't he go for letters patent either during this period or way before, as he did for the nuns?
Yeah. Well, we talked about that a little bit last night, and my answer to that basically is that, first of all, this was a unique creation that didn't fit any of the categories through which he could apply for such letters patent. That's one thing. And the other thing is he did it for the nuns because Roland was going that route, but all Roland was asking for was approval for an order of lay sisters that would be limited to the Diocese of Rheims. So it was a diocesan thing. So the fact that this didn't fit categories, number one, and he didn't want it tied to Paris or to any other particular place. See, here, this is a situation in Paris. He's still conscious of Rheims, and he's already started in Rouen, and he's down as far as Avignon, and up as far as Calais. And to get letters patent for such a rambling thing now, so it's all, and he said he really that the brothers could do that when they were ready, but in his lifetime he had no interest in it. The brothers were trying to get him to do that when James II came to visit the Grand Maison with the Irish kids. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I'm just toying with the idea then, how does that fit in with nationalism? Is there a sort of a correspondence in the founder's mind of sort of going pan-diocesan, and that's unusual.
I mean, for all the dioceses of France? I suppose that's what he envisioned. He thought that this, and I think that's the key to why he wanted a foot in Avignon and why he wanted a link to the papacy. That the way of being trans-diocesan was to have some kind of an informal approval or some kind of a relationship with the Bishop of Rome. But he didn't want to get stuck under the jurisdiction of any particular diocese, that's for sure.
And the reason is?
He wanted to preserve what he thought was the unique character of what they were doing. He didn't want them to be clerics, but he wanted them to have a religious character. And he didn't want them to fall into the trap of being a religious order. Something similar to what Vincent de Paul was trying to do, and other founders. Even in a certain sense, Ignatius, who didn't fit all the traditional categories either. After all, remember, Ignatius originally called his associates his companions. You don't seem satisfied.
No, I'm
You know, you have to. There's an awful lot of speculation involved in all of these things, of course. Yes.
Another thing that interests me, maybe you'd comment on. At the same time that all this legal stuff is going on, you have founder coming out with writing rules of Christian rule being revived, and also you have Lane talking about time, spending all this time in prayer and so on. So it's like a recluse. So you're the founder in court, a recluse, and writing all kinds of important documents for the Institute.
Well, you know, that struck me for the first time when I started thinking of putting a few things that I had spotted when I discovered the Cahiers, let's say. So the first part of that Cahiers was my first discovery in the Cahiers. The second part of it about the situation in France is something that I picked up from Chris Kavanagh at the Sill. Jean Pungier was giving that to the Sillis, 1978 or 9, somewhere through there. But then, looking through the Cahiers, I saw this chronology. When I began to look at it, I said, my God, just looking at this chronology gives you a totally different picture of the founder. He was a busy, busy person. And at that time, Charles Henry was no longer superior, and he was trying to get something going on Lasallian publications, and had already arranged to have announce the Gospel to the Poor translated. They hired a translator for that. And so I said, well, I've found a couple of things that I think are fascinating, and this was one of them. So when I sent him the first thing, Charlie Henry wrote back and said the same thing. He said, I never pictured the founder before as the busy person he was until he read through the actual, almost day by day, the account of what he was doing all the time. And so that's of course, it just fills in the picture somewhat different.
Talking about time, here's the great Chetardy and so on, these people, investing so much time in one area of concern, education. How about all the, particularly Chetardy, you'd almost think it was the biggest thing, education.
Well, I think for him maybe it was, from what we know about his character. He had a great reputation as a catechist, and I think that they saw that education was the clue to having a decent parish. It's what the American bishops came to think when they began to deal with the immigrant generations here. That the only way to keep this Catholic crowd together and to keep them Catholics was to set up an educational system that went all the way from the kindergarten to the PhD. And a parallel social services that went all the way from the womb to the tomb. You're born in a Catholic hospital, and you get sick and you go to a Catholic hospital, and when you're dead, you're buried in a Catholic cemetery. Well, I'd just like to go back now to page 8 of this third volume. And we ought to at least pay a little bit of attention to this thorny question, which is at the heart of this whole business about what does it mean to teach the poor. Now, De La Salle would not have had any of this trouble. Well, he probably would have, because, maybe he wouldn't have, but because of the Sulpicians. But at the heart of the legal question, really, which could be glossed over from time to time, Chetardy could have covered this over if he wanted to. But at the heart of the legal question was the educational system at the time, which insisted on segregated schools for the poor. In writing this up, I make the point that, as a matter of fact, John Baptist de La Salle was disobeying the law because the law insisted on the segregation of the rich and the poor. It's really what it amounted to. Because every parish had charity schools for the poor, and the pastor could do anything he wanted with those. Right? But schools for writing were carefully controlled, and were only for those who could afford the fees to go into apprenticeship. And the little schools were controlled by the diocese, and they were also fee schools, and although theoretically they were supposed to accept poor kids, it was such a social situation that there was no way they could do it. But De La Salle's stubbornness, if you will, or his, another way of putting it, his vision for the Institute is that you couldn't do anything for the poor unless, first of all, you gave them a quality education, right? And unless that was completely gratuitous, and that there wasn't any reason why that quality education couldn't be available to anybody who wanted to come, but provided they wouldn't pay, because he didn't want anybody to have any control over the policy of the school or the internal thing. I think that's his fundamental thing, that if he started accepting money from this one or that one, there would be a distinction in the school between the paying and the non-paying students, and there would be an attempt on the part of the people who are beginning to pay and subsidize this thing, as happens all the time with us. All these things we get from alumni who they give $1,000 a year and expect that they're able to control the policies of the religion department, for example. The other $1,000 they give to the Wanderer or something. Well, so I think that this is at the center of this thing. But now on page 8 and 9 here, Blanc gives his arguments, huh? And when Blanc starts trying to argue this thing, he goes around in circles. Have you noticed this? He'll say, oh, they are. They're all poor. Sure, they're all poor. There aren't very many rich. Out of 100, maybe 3 or 4 could afford to pay. But even if they could afford to pay, they're really, supposing they are rich. How do we know they're rich? You know, maybe they're in debt. Maybe they're over their head, etc., etc. And anyway, who wants to admit that they're poor? Isn't it a terrible thing to make people? What are you going to do? Go and look at their bank accounts, or have an investigation? So he's continually arguing around. I don't think that would be the thoughts of the founder. If you look at page 8, where you have that 9, where you have that big list of 9 points, he says the petition, the first petition, filed with false allegations. It wasn't false at all. There was nothing false about it. The brothers were doing what they weren't supposed to do. It was nevertheless believed. Consequently, the lieutenant of the police allowed the schoolmasters to cite the brothers, and it isn't the schoolmasters, it's the writing masters, and their superior before the court. This was done without. De La Salle could have defended himself by pointing out he was authorized by his eminence to direct a community of brothers. Well, that isn't exactly correct either. That this authorization made him their superior, and therefore empowered him, that he wasn't a pastor, and nothing being superior. That it was not possible for him and the brothers to identify the large number who came seeking, to identify among them those who might belong to fairly well-to-do. That even if it were possible to do, he couldn't judge fairly about their financial position without a juridical, etc. He had no right to make any such inquiry. It would be rash of him to pass judgment. That if he and the brothers undertook to discriminate, not only they'd run the base, they would make a mistake, but they'd be open to insult. That the fact some of them are called surgeons, masons, butchers, locksmith, wine merchant, and he's got that in the paragraph opposite. And of course, this was what the writing masters came with the evidence. Huh? Look at the list of the people, and they followed them around. That was what they were doing once these judgments were passed. They'd follow the kids home from school to see where they went, and they tried to get the lists. So what they were able to discover and present as evidence is on the previous page. The main ones were these: a man living on the revenues from his investments, 2 surgeons, 1 butcher. It's interesting he puts the 2 together. A locksmith, a wine merchant, a grocery man, a jeweler, and 2 restaurant owners. So that's the type of kids that were starting to come to the schools by this stage of the game. So Blanc is really, I don't think he understands the founders' originality. He doesn't understand the founders' concept of what the community was in terms of its relationship to church structures. He thinks of it all the time as a religious order. And I don't think he understands what the founder was after on this principle of gratuity. That effectively, it was combating a social evil, I think. Huh? It was making it possible for not terribly wealthy people, but for people to get a quality education that was practical and that made sense and that would mingle these very tremendous education and advantage for these very poor people, the poor kids, would be to learn what it is to live side by side and to go to school side by side with the kids whose families had begun to make it in the world and to begin to build networks and connections and so on with them. It certainly must have been a tremendous advantage. And it was breaking down some of these sharp social distinctions. There's no question it was against the law, and that as far as as the cases, these things were in both courts for the longest time, and litigation and so on and so forth, the judgment was that they were, in fact, violating the law. And the only way they could have been protected, and that could have been covered over, would have been by some blanket assurance from the pastor that this was all under his control and that he had his eye on it. Even though he would have had, in that case, to sort of be an accessory after the fact in helping to violate the law, as the pastor did in 1690 and 1698, with the two schools on the Rutabaga and the Plus. Okay? Well, I think that's more than enough for the 4th of July. We shoot off. Anybody want to shoot off some firecrackers? Maybe.
We have a couple of announcements before everybody gets